Negro himself, and the life which he is forced to lead, can we arrive at the proper procedure in this crisis? Nothing particularly poetic or profound about those words, but terribly relevant and instructive in this particular moment. Because that social and political analysis are the building blocks for young people to be able to make the distinction between a statistical point to say, for example, and I'll just throw out one of the most commonly cited, that 70% of all African children are born out of wedlock, as if that in and of itself tells us all we need to know about the crisis of Black culture and the inattention to marriage. And I'm being particularly provocative here because we don't want to skirt what we all know and hear. This cuts right to the heart of the matter. So that kind of statistic is readily available to all of us. It automatically communicates powerful information. We all feel like we know it. We all have an opinion about it. And therefore, there's no more work to be done. And that's the kind of example that I believe Carter G. Woodson was making clear to us is deeply problematic, because that form of just having information can lead to confusion about what it actually means. And that if you take that point of view, if you don't study, right, it's about the study, not because we're all elite intellectuals in the room, that's not the point, but that we have to reflect on the information in a particular social and political context, that it does not speak for itself. Which brings me then to statistics. Statistics has become the most dominant form of communication in our society. It is a form of narrative that tells stories, but in a world ready-made for a tweet. Third, those 140, again, someday someone will look back at this moment and say, the data explosion, big data, and you can Google big data. There are leading scholars around the world studying what does big data mean to the world that we live in the future that will be upon us. Well, I would guess in this moment, not being one of those scholars and not having the training to fully support this claim, that it's not an accident that big data and statistics as the dominant form of communication preceded a form of communication known as tweeting that is perfectly suited to communicating information through simple statistical expression, which tells us everything that we need to know. No journalist today, for example, it would seem to me, can explain anything without citing polling data, census data, crime statistics, and it's incredibly compelling. You will hear me cite statistics throughout this. We are all implicated. But the implications of those call us to the responsibility to use statistics not as the ending point of the conversation, not as a moment and opportunity to end debates, not as a moment of saying we all know because the numbers speak for themselves and tell us all that we need to know, but as the start of a conversation, as a start of a conversation about properly diagnosing and assessing the world that we actually live in, rather than assuming that the statistics already tell us everything we need to know. Do you follow me on that? Because that's a really big point for me in communicating what the challenge is for how we educate our young people today, not how we simply inform them of their terrible lives. Information is not education. We live in an information age, not an education age. Knowledge emerges at the intersection of information and study, reflection, critique, debate, and doubt. Doubt's a big part of the difference between an educated person and an educated fool. What makes higher education so important to the process of becoming an adult, becoming an engaged citizen in the world, becoming enlightened? We've shied away from what higher education is really about. Partly because it makes those of us in it feel uncomfortable. Partly because there's so much anti-intellectualism in the world that college has been identified as Mark's territory. Remember Rick Santorum's critique of college as a bastion of snobs, that most real Americans don't want to go to college because it's liberal indoctrination training camp? I mean, and yet we know that Rick Santorum will send his children to college. But this is exactly the way in which arrogance is the enemy of education. You have to have doubt. Doubt is what brings one to lifelong study. Doubt is what brings one to the discipline of dissertating, of actually knowing that there's more out there that one doesn't know in the pursuit of that. Now, we can do it at the cost and expense of wide engagement, of public engagement, of being connected to the world. So there are limits, right? So just for you graduate students and other folk out here who plan to go on to graduate school, don't miss the forest for the trees. You know, you want to be educated in the service of something. In the service of something. So think about what that something is for you. To be knowledgeable, one must always assume that there is an unknown and an unknowable. An unknown and an unknowable. Isn't that the opposite of what statistics are about? Statistics, by definition, are an assertion of truth and certainty. Now, when we add footnotes to them, when we put little asterisks on them, when you read the fine print, the best of us who use statistics, the best social scientists, the best journalists will tell you the limits of that data. But our young people don't know that. And the people whose interests are opposed to the growth and development, to the healthiness of our young people, aren't trafficking in captions and footnotes and asterisks and parentheses. They're using the known to articulate everything. So part of knowledge is knowing that there's more to the story. There's another danger here, and I know most of you already know this about statistics, but I just want to make it clear. The other danger here is that if we cannot assert a fact tied to positivist methodologies or empirical evidence or something that produces quantitative data, then we can't make certain claims that it is real or that it exists. That's the world we live in right now. And think about how damaging that is to our collective humanity. Think of how much of an assault that is on the arts, on literature, on our emotional state. To be able to determine why something is happening in the world, why someone did that is tied to, strictly speaking, polling data, census data, demographic data, prison data, mortality data, disease rates, obesity rates, is to essentially limit all the things that make us human. We are not test tubes. We are not animals operating in animal kingdom. I would argue that even our natural scientists have overstated their claims about understanding the natural world. It's a harder point to prove because the animals have less ability to speak for themselves than we can understand. They're speaking. We just can't translate as best we should be able to. But the notion that the unknowable is no longer subject to political and social analysis, right? That's the point. The stuff that we can't put in a chart or a graph is off the table for political and social analysis will be the death of us. It has been the death of too many of us thus far. Because one of the lessons of the relationship between racial crime statistics, which I'm going to spend some time talking about as I move into condemnation of blackness, has been about using statistics to discount any other form of knowledge that is not quantifiable. The simple charge that racism exists in the criminal justice system not only has shaped Supreme Court jurisprudence in the service of needing an officer, for example, in a random encounter with a citizen, you can only make a claim, you can only have a legal standing in court in this day and age, right now in 2013, for racism in the criminal justice system, if the cop or the prosecutor or the judge calls you a nigger, or makes some other ethnic or religious slur against you. Otherwise, you can hang it up. Even the best data, as was revealed in a case several years ago about death penalty being applied disproportionately in cases where the perpetrator was black and the victim was white, was insufficient to a Supreme Court that could make thoughtfully the distinction between a system that produced a racially disparate outcome, more black men in particular being put to death for acts of violence that ended up in the death of a white person. They could recognize that. This was called the Baldus study, B-A-L-D-U-S. You can look it up on phones. They could see that, but because they couldn't attribute to an individual the responsibility for that collective outcome, it could not be upheld as an instance of racial discrimination, and therefore Georgia's death penalty statutes could stand. What's the lesson in that? The lesson is that we cannot accept that those are the terms of our political and social analysis. We cannot win at that game, because that game serves a particular political purpose in our society, which has been to limit and to mute the voices of those who have long spoken to their full humanity. Those study groups, for example, in the early 1960s, that gave birth to, for example, the Black Panther Party in Oakland at San Francisco State University. They were not reading the State of Black America Statistical Index published by the National Urban League. They were not. And I say this partly as a strong criticism of that kind of work, but also because it is not an insidious conspiratorial act. There are those in our system who are engaging in these kinds of statistically rich conversations about us who will not accept any other form, any other, what we say, counter-narrative that is not rooted in data. But we ourselves have been complicit in it for the best of reasons. For the best of reasons. And Du Bois stands at the intersection of the attempt to use the best of data to make the case for Black people's humanity. Du Bois was the first Black trained social scientist. Carter G. Woodson's contemporary as a historian, Du Bois as a social scientist who wanted to do more history and literature than social science. But he started out committed to the data, committed to making the case in the terms in which those who were using social science to prove that racism was not a problem in American society. Du Bois wanted to meet them on their terms, and he could not. As much as I celebrate the agency of Du Bois and the life that he lived and the contributions that he made, he lost that battle. And the evidence of the work that he did after that is the best proof of the case. He left the world of formal academics, of formal methodology, to pursue an amazing life of literature, of biography, of autobiography, of what he called propaganda, because he realized that he couldn't win with a frontal assault on the data. The data couldn't take down the data, especially when the apparatus, the infrastructure of vetting data, the review process, as you know it today, was a white supremacist review structure. I'll offer a little bit of evidence in this in some slides, but you'll have to read Condemnation to take a closer examination of that if you are troubled by that claim. So let me move then to condemnation, because I want to use it as a window onto the origins of these problems. I want to make the case that we've ended up with this problem of historical illiteracy and mass incarceration. The relationship of the two go through a history of statistics that was from the very beginning meant to only talk about us in one particular way, through one particular genre of communication. The the birth of the black crime problem. We take as a given today that we can make certain claims about